Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Writing a memoir, if you're honest, if you're serious about the process, can be a way to really come to terms with your own faults. And the writers of the two memoirs we've got for you today do that to varying degrees. In a bit, we'll hear a memoir about the struggles of sobriety. Not getting sober, but staying sober, even after decades of sobriety under your belt. But first, H.R. McMaster was a national security advisor to former President Trump, and he's got a memoir out now titled At War with Ourselves, about his time in the Trump administration. He spoke with NPR's Steve Inskeep and talked about being, at times, overly confident in his abilities as a statesman to work with other people and accomplish common goals. And when he says that, he's not talking about foreign entities or even people on the other side of the aisle, but about other people in Trump's orbit. That's coming up.
This message is brought to you by Warby Parker. Their glasses start at $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. Go to warbyparker.com/covered.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Wise, the app that makes managing your money in different currencies easy. With Wise, you can send and spend money internationally at the mid-market exchange rate. No guesswork and no hidden fees. Learn more about how Wise could work for you at wise.com.
General H.R. McMaster is a soldier and a scholar. He served in war zones and in archives. Now he's written a book called At War with Ourselves, a memoir of his experience in America's toxic politics.
It's undermining our ability to be effective, even in areas of foreign policy and in national security.
Was the president you served a significant part of making that problem worse?
Oh, of course he was. Yes. But oftentimes the reaction to him is even worse.
McMaster served as national security advisor for President Trump. His memoir arrives just as Trump seeks to return to power. In McMaster's telling, the Trump administration accomplished more on foreign policy than its critics might admit. But Trump himself was manipulated by aides at home and dictators abroad. McMaster says his service in Iraq and Afghanistan led him to take the offer to work for Trump.
I had been on the receiving end of policies and strategies developed in Washington that made no sense to me when I was in places like Baghdad or Kabul. So I saw it as an opportunity to help a disruptive president disrupt a lot of what needed to be disrupted in the area of foreign policy and in national security.
He argues that in Trump's early years, U.S. policy in Asia became more realistic. But as the official charged with coordinating security policy, McMaster struggled with other players, like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, and presidential aide Steve Bannon.
I think that there are 3 types of people based on their base motivations in any White House. I think the first category are people who go into the administration to help the elected president determine his or her own agenda.
McMaster thought he was in that category.
The second group of people, I think, come into any White House or any administration to advance their own agenda. The third group of people, I think, are people who are motivated mainly by the desire to protect the country and maybe the world from the president. And I think in the Trump administration, that second and third category of people were quite large.
I'm thinking about the way you've written about those characters that I named, and it sounds like maybe Steve Bannon would be in the manipulator category, in your opinion, and Tillerson and Mattis might be more in the protecting the country from the president category. Is that right?
I think that's right, Steve. And so I was aware as a historian of those tensions in the past. I was perhaps overconfident in my ability to transcend those tensions and to have a harmonious relationship. But that's one of the areas in which I failed and we failed to work together better.
You write, I believe at one point, that you sort of invited yourself onto Tillerson's and Mattis's team, and they did not reciprocate.
Well, I used to joke with them. I would say, hey, I know you have your club of 2 going, but if you ever want to expand it to a club of 3, I'm embarrassingly free.
Why do you think they didn't take you up on that?
Well, I think that they saw me as maybe an extension of Donald Trump. They saw President Trump as a danger that had to be contained. And I think that there was a lack of trust in letting me into their club.
You write that you told your wife, and this is a quote, "After over a year on this job, I cannot understand Putin's hold on Trump." Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. If you witnessed that, Putin's influence over the president of the United States, why did you not consider him a danger?
Well, I don't think he was a danger, and I was there to help give him advice to the contrary of his predilections. You know, what President Trump was driven by is actually, I think, what President Obama was driven by and President George W. Bush was driven by when they were early in their administrations with Putin. Putin is a great liar. He's a great deceiver.
He offers each new president flattery and the prospect of global cooperation.
So I would alert the president to this. He often didn't want to hear it because President Trump, has great confidence in his ability to make deals. And he wanted a big deal with Putin that would fundamentally transform the relationship and lead to cooperation rather than confrontation and competition.
McMaster writes of a dysfunctional moment when President Trump prepared to give a speech at NATO headquarters in Europe. It was May of 2017. Trump, like his predecessors, wanted to push NATO nations to spend more in their own defense.
But he had this idea that one of the ways that he could cajole them, encourage them into spending more in defense is to say, hey, if they don't pay 2% in defense or invest 2% in defense, then we won't defend you.
McMaster learned the president had made edits to his speech, cutting a line that affirmed the U.S. commitment to defend its allies.
And right before we were getting in the motorcade for him to give that speech, he had written in some additional lines to the effect of, hey, we're not going to defend you if you don't pay. And I encountered Secretary Tillerson and Mattis, and I said to both of them, hey, I need you to get in the car with me. This is called the Beast, the president's armored car, so we can explain to him how this cuts against his purpose and modify the speech, because the new speech was going into the teleprompter at that moment. And the two of them were reluctant to get in. And I said, please just get in the effing car, and we did get in the car, and we did convince the president that that line was gratuitous. In fact, he was giving a speech in front of the 9/11 memorial, which was highlighting the fact that the only time that NATO has gone to war on behalf of a member nation who came under attack was after the mass murder attacks of September 11th, 2001. So we did convince the president, but of course this would remain a theme across his presidency and into his candidacy now as well.
Well, that's why this anecdote was on my mind. He has said during this presidential campaign exactly the same thing you persuaded him to take out of that speech, that he would literally tell Russia to do whatever the hell they want to a country that, as Trump sees it, doesn't pay its dues, which is an incorrect statement also.
Right. And so the issues that I write about in the book, they're still live issues today, Steve.
By 2018, McMaster's relationship with Trump was strained. The president kept responding warmly to Putin's flattery and even tried to send him an overly friendly letter that McMaster intercepted. Finally, Trump dismissed his national security advisor, though he called McMaster his friend. Years later, Trump tried to overturn his election defeat, which McMaster sees as a dereliction of his constitutional duty. If asked to serve in a new Trump administration, would you do it?
Steve, I would love to serve in any administration where I can make a difference. And so the answer is no, because I don't think I could make a positive difference at this stage. If President Trump was reelected, of course, I wish him best and I want him to succeed. If our next president is Kamala Harris, I wish her the best, wish her to succeed. But I think my opportunity to serve in the Trump administration is used up.
Yet H.R. McMaster says if Trump is elected, he would encourage others to serve, just as he once did, and do the best they can. His book is called At War with Ourselves. This is NPR News. This election season, you can expect to hear a lot of news, some of it meaningful, much of it not. Give the Up First podcast 15 minutes, sometimes a little less, and we'll help you sort it out, what's going on around the world and at home. 3 stories, 15 minutes, Up First every day. Listen every morning wherever you get your podcasts.
This message comes from MSNBC. What's causing the rise in book banning? On the second season of the Velshi Banned Book Club podcast, Ali Velshi speaks with authors of banned books to try and find out. Search for Velshi Banned Book Club to follow and listen to the series.
When I got my wisdom teeth taken out, I got a prescription for a huge bottle of painkillers. I took a couple here and there as needed, but they mostly collected dust in the medicine cabinet. Many people in this world do not have the luxury of just taking 1 or 2 painkillers and calling it a day. William Cope Moyers is one of those people, and his new memoir is about staying sober when prescription opiates are so readily available. It's called Broken Open, and he spoke with NPR's Scott Simon about realizing how vulnerable he was, even after decades of sobriety.
William Cope Moyers wrote of his addiction to alcohol and crack cocaine in a memoir called Broken, When it was published in 2006, he'd been living sober for over a decade and had become Vice President of Public Affairs at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. But staying sober has its own challenges. And that struggle is the subject of William Cope Moyers' new memoir, Broken Open, What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. He joins us from the studios of Minnesota Public Radio in St. Paul. Thanks so much for being with us, William.
Thank you, Scott, for having me on with you today.
The story of how you got clean in your first memoir inspired many people. But did your story become a kind of burden to you?
Yes, in the sense that I had to live up to what I had written in my first memoir. And that's a good news story. That's a story that has inspired the hope in thousands of people who need what I have and what I have lived, which is recovery. But since addiction is a chronic illness, it's one that, while there is no cure, there's a solution. And sometimes that solution can be interrupted by the rest of life and the rest of the journey. And that's exactly the burden that I encountered, years after I had found recovery. And then all of a sudden, there I am again at the precipice.
Help us understand what happened. Your marriage came apart. I'll just leave it at that. You discovered you needed dental surgery. What happened when you got that hit of nitrous oxide?
Well, the nitrous oxide caused me to weep. And I've always been fascinated by the experience because I don't know what it was that shook me so, except I think it was a realization that there I was, vulnerable again. It almost seemed to separate me from my recovery in the way that I had always taken for granted. And of course, after that, I was prescribed narcotic pain pills to manage the pain of the dental procedure that I was in the chair for.
With the advantage of hindsight, should you and your doctors have had reservations about painkillers, given your personal history of addiction?
Of course. And even though, Scott, narcotics or opiates were not my thing, I am an addict and an alcoholic. Yes, I had decades of recovery. Yes, I loved recovery. But I'm a vulnerable person. I have a brain that processes these substances differently than the vast majority of the public. And so, yes, I should have been more vigilant, and my doctors probably could have been. But we all were under the same assumption, Scott. Look, Moyers is a recovery advocate for Hazel and Betty Ford. He shares his story. He has decades of recovery. He'll be able to handle it. And of course, I wasn't able to handle it.
What happened?
Well, I took the narcotic pain pills as I was prescribed over the first 4 days. And then on the fourth or fifth day, as I write in my book, I took a, quote, +1, which is not a good thing for anybody, but particularly for somebody of my ilk, somebody of my vulnerability, with somebody with my history of addiction, is a red flag. I took an extra pill because I figured, if 2 make me feel good and take away the pain, 3 will be better. And there began my multi-year struggle with my inability to get off of those things, especially using, Scott, the tools that I had always used to stay sober off those other substances that I had written about earlier on. And there you go.
And William Cope Moyers can't just walk into a doctor's office or clinic, for that matter, where you worked at Hazelden Betty Ford, and say, help me.
Well, ironically, though, that's in the end what I had to do, Scott. I went to my internist, who had been my internist for 20 some odd years and also was a man in recovery himself. And I said, I've got to stop this. I need help. And he said, William, I can't help you here in this setting. You need to go and see. And he referred me to an addiction doctor in Minneapolis, Dr. David Friends. And so I went to Dr. Friends' office in January of 2016. And there I found the solution. I found the answer to my inability to tamp down that craving brain and that inability to get myself righted again. I found the answer.
What did you learn about recovery? I was about to say the second time around, but it's not as if you just turn a corner, is it? I mean, there are many corners to turn.
That's right. And I've learned in my own journey, and I think it's so important in the message of my book, I had to take an anti-craving medication called Suboxone or buprenorphine to quiet that brain. I was very fortunate that I had all the other tools that I had used for so long, whether it was my recovery group, whether it was my faith, whether it was my community. I had all those tools already. And what I discovered when I took the anti-craving medication and got back sort of in the middle of the bed, if you will, and got on with the rest of my life is that for me, I learned that recovery is possible even when sobriety is jeopardized. And I think that's a very important message that we realize in this day and age, that there are many pathways to recovery. And as long as that pathway treats the person with dignity and respect, whatever that pathway is important and it is attainable.
Do you have concerns about people that don't have the kind of access to help and care that, for example, you have?
You mean the vast majority of people in the United States? Yes, Scott. That's the sad tragedy of this situation. Listen, I had access to treatment 4 times over 5 years between 1989 and 1994. I have private health insurance that helps to cover some of the cost of my medication. And when I needed to get to Dr. Friends in Minneapolis, I had access to him. At Hazel and Betty Ford, we treat about 25,000 people a year. And while that sounds like a big number, it's a fraction of the problem in this country. And, September is Recovery Month, as it's been proclaimed by the federal government for a long time now. There are millions of people like me who celebrate our recovery. But sadly, there are millions of others that don't. And it is because they cannot get the access to the care that they need.
Wrote down this line from your book: it's okay to be a work in progress.
Yeah. And I've learned that along my long journey. I came out of a crack house in Harlem, New York in 1989 with the support of my family and friends. And I've been walking that journey of recovery ever since August of 1989, 35 years. I am a work in progress, and it's so important for people like me to learn from the things that we do right and to learn from the mistakes that we made, to learn from the good things we do for other people and the things that we need to do better for ourselves. I have learned in my own journey for 35 years now that if I remain teachable, I'm going to be okay. And I think that's what the essence of this book really reflects in the end.
William Cope Moyers, his new book, Broken Open. Thanks so much for being with us, William.
Thank you, Scott.
And that's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. If you want more, you can sign up for our newsletter at npr.org/newsletter/books. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Chloe Weiner and edited by Sierra Crawford. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Adriana Gallardo, Monsi Kurana, Tinbi Ermias, Jordan Marie Smith, David West, Olivia Hampton, Emiko Tamagawa, Mark Navin, Lily Quiroz, Rina Advani, Fernando Nararoman, Shanna Rhodes, and Will Jarvis. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Christian nationalists want to turn America into a theocracy, a government under biblical rule. If they gain more power, it could mean fewer rights for you. I'm Heath Drusen, and on the new season of Extremely American, I'll take you inside the movement. Listen to Extremely American from Boise State Public Radio, part of the NPR network.